I'd now like to introduce Trevor Simpson to share some of the ups and downs, literally and figuratively, of the Canadian Airlines account at McKim. Trevor joined McKim in 1978 as an account supervisor on Chevron. Over the next 10 years, his responsibilities expanded until he found himself Vice President Account Group Director, responsible for all the agency's accounts save one. His involvement with Canadian Airlines came just before the major agency review in 1988, when he was promoted to Director of Client Services and later to Executive VP Western Canada, but still running the airline account. Quote, a bit like being put in charge of the Alamo, he joked before the airline took over his life. The account became a voracious, challenging monster, absorbing PWA, then Bordair, while undergoing dramatic and significant shifts in management. During his 3 years on the account, he describes lurching from crisis to crisis, producing award-winning works at times under immense pressure, and despite the client's best effort to emasculate it. Finally, following the Bordair merger and more newer management, McKim was asked to participate in a third review in 3 years. With some delight, he resigned the account. This gave him the opportunity to finally complete his midlife crisis, leaving McKim to cash in 360,000 travel bonus points for 2 first-class tickets around the world. After over a year of travel, he began to work as a consultant for some of the clients he really liked, including Chevron, Whistler Blackcomb, and also Alvin, who would hire him because he had a suit. This also began his great journey of personal exploration, resulting in a passion for the great mystery we're all a part of. He now shares this with others as a spiritual coach, teaching decision-making, dreams, and intuition. Trevor, over to you.
Wow, it's kind of stunning, isn't it? You know, just to take this trip down memory lane with these faces of people you kind of thought you recognized but weren't quite sure, and others who continue to be part of your life. It's been wonderful, and I particularly want to recognize my predecessors as manager, Frank Anfield and David Chesney, who were such key parts of my life. And that vibrant period during the 80s where McKim really did shine. We were a marvelous place to work, and we produced marvelous work for our clients. It was Frank who hired me, incidentally, which I thought was a great act of faith, because I worked for one of his clients and left him holding a bill for $80,000 when we went under. And yet somehow he had the charity in his heart to invite me in and offer me a job. And it was something that I don't think either of us ever regretted. And I've always appreciated having Frank in my life. He was my great mentor through this business. And of course was my management supervisor on Canadian when I first took over the account. I never wanted to work on Canadian. I never had any interest in working on Canadian. Frankly, I thought they were a bad client. I looked around the agency and I'd see these incredibly stressed out people who would work weekends, they'd work nights. How many of you watched Mad Men? Do you remember the relationship with Conrad Hilton and Don Draper? You know, he thought he owned him. Well, that's the sort of relationship that some of our Canadian clients had with the agency. They thought they owned us, and that they had the right to call you and visit you any time of the day or night. Well, I wanted nothing to do with that, I have to tell you. I had a great life in Vancouver. I had clients I loved. And then one day something happened. I got called into a meeting. Frank Anfield was in town. He was spearheading the second agency review, which was now a much bigger competition, up against 5 of Canada's biggest agencies. And he had 2 weeks to put it together. And to my surprise, I got called into Bev, asked me to join him in his office, and I had a busy day, and I didn't finally get round to it till about 4 o'clock. And when I joined them, I said, by the way, I have to leave in about half an hour. I'm going to the dentist. And then Frank sort of took a deep breath, and he started to tell me this story that was so bemusing. It was like out of Mad Men. He said, well, as you know, we're doing this major review with Canadian. They have told us the account manager is not appropriate, and we have to appoint someone else. He said, I hired someone. They were due to start today. Then there was sort of this pregnant pause, and he said, and they haven't showed up. We don't know where they are. And he said, so we've decided we have to move to plan B. We intend to switch you with your colleague, and he will take over your accounts, and you will take over Canadian. Then I took a deep breath and said, you know, I really do have to go to the dentist. And But then Frank, I looked at Frank and I said, you know, really, I don't want to do this, Frank. This doesn't interest me. I will never forget this moment. I don't know whether Frank remembers it. Frank, for all his avuncular sort of jolly looks, has this rod of steel in his back. And he looks at you with these piercing eyes, and he assumes his best Godfather act. And he said these words to me: "You have to recognize your cozy little life is over." He said, you can take this job and your life will change, or you can not take it and we lose the Canadian account and your life will change. He'd made me the offer that I couldn't refuse. But I guess I decided I did really need to go to the dentist, and I said, look, I can't make a decision, I need to go to the dentist, I will come back and see you in an hour. And it was in the dentist's chair that this kind of outrageous idea came to me, that basically I was in a position to ask for everything. And so I came back from the dentist and I said, Frank, here's what I'll offer. I will take over Canadian, but I want to keep everything. I said, you make me Director of Client Services and trust me to manage the business. We shook hands and the die was cast. I'm still not sure whether that was unbridled brilliance or outrageous stupidity, but it was a moment that forever changed my life. I can trace every single event in my life to that crossroads. That wonderful poem by Robert Frost, "Two roads diverge in a wood." That was my moment when the roads diverged, and I took, in many ways, the road less travelled by. And I began to work on Canadian. I played a very coincidental role in the review. I had the privilege of watching a tour de force, which was Frank Anfield, in many ways single-handedly master this challenge over great odds. We even had one person who was very key in putting together the audio-visual presentation have a seizure and have to go to hospital in the middle of the evening. And so Frank had to take over at that point and even coordinate that part of the operation. It was an amazing thing to witness. Alvin shared with me a story the other day that just has to be told because it is so remarkable. We had developed two campaigns to present to Canadian Airlines. We presented a campaign which was more logical, rational, product-oriented, which had the banner, "We are Canadian," and another campaign developed by an amazing creative team named Watt and Bird, who had, long before Molson used the line, had come up with a much more emotional, destination-based campaign titled "I Am Canadian." And so anyway, we were all ready to present these two ideas, and then just before the presentation, Frank had to go to the washroom. He's sitting in the stall, and he hears the client come in after the presentation. And he hears one of them say, "What kind of agency is that? They present two campaigns and expect us to make the choice?" At that moment, Frank said to himself, "Well, we're certainly not that kind of agency," and flushed the "I Am Canadian" down the toilet. And then went back to his bemused friends to explain to them that we were only presenting one campaign. Well, history, of course, no. We won the review, and I got to start my work on Canadian. And the first thing that happened was we actually didn't win it totally because we lost the French. The French went to BCP, but we kept the English, which was the giant size of the account, giant proportion of the account. And I began work, and the first meeting I go to, Howard mentioned I felt I lurched from crisis to crisis. It really felt like that during this relatively brief time that I ran this account. And they said, first thing they always said to me was, "Well, you didn't win the review, but you didn't lose it." Basically, no one had showed them anything that had caused them to leap out of their seats, and they made the decision to continue working with us because it seemed the best alternative. And so we began to work with them on the big idea. They felt that perhaps with their direction and influence, we would be more likely to come up with the great idea. Why are some of you laughing now? What in fact happened was, over the next 6 months, we fought our way through various scraps because we had two clients who represented different points of view. One of them really wanted to do the more rational concept, product concept. The other wanted more emotion, and we were trying to draw a line between the two of them. Anyway, we finally got a campaign developed that was improved. And by now it's about 6 months after the review. It's actually November, and I've just been promoted. Bev's decided to retire. I've just been promoted. And Bev and I are in his office, and he's invited the legendary Hugo Powell, who of course was Gabe's boss at one time. Hugo was a remarkable man who ended up running the Interbrew Brewery in Belgium. And Bev was telling him that I was being promoted and taking over the job, and Hugo was saying some very uncharacteristically pleasant things about how much I deserved it. And at that moment, as I'm sitting there, a bit like the cat who's just enjoyed the cream, there's a knock on the door, and it's my secretary. And she said, "You must take this call. You must take this call." And so I stepped out, and feeling somewhat annoyed at having my moment broken. And I walked in, picked up the phone, and it was my client. And he said, from Canadian Airlines, and he said, "I have to tell you that everything you've worked on in the last 6 months is rejected. We have decided to take the French creative and brand it into English, unless you can solve this problem in 4 days." We have worked on this problem for 3 months prior to the agency review, for 6 months following the agency review, and now we have 4 days. Well, it was kind of like moving from the top of Everest to the bottom of the Mariana Trench in 35 seconds, right? And whenever I used to interview people who were interested in coming to advertising, I would say, you know, one thing you must learn, if you can't handle the extreme peaks, from the absolute moments of great achievement to the absolute pits, then you shouldn't be in this business. Because all of us in this business have experienced that, right? It's just part of the business. So we eventually had 4 days, and I worked with Alvin and Tim Dundon and Brian Musgrove, who is in the room. And so we had our briefing from the client, and then those guys went off to work. And in my relationship with the creative department, I'd learned some things over my career. The first one is that the only thing that matters is a deadline, right? They tell you they want time, but it's actually not true. They don't want time. They need a deadline, then they'll get something done. So I also knew there was no point in bothering them for the next few days. I need to just let them do their thing. And so 3 days later, I went down to Tim's office. The three of them were in Tim's office. I said, "Can you guys give me a process review?" And they kind of reviewed with me sort of 3 kind of ideas, and I felt my heart sink into my boots. And I thought, oh my God, we're doomed. My first act as manager is going to be to lose the agency's biggest account. And so I did a slightly impassioned, no, this isn't going to work. We need to have something that's bigger. We need to have something that covers the whole of the Canadian world. We need to have something that embraces all of their products. It needs to be one idea. And then I left and went to a meeting and that afternoon, knowing that we had a presentation the next day. 2 hours later, there was a knock on the door. It was Alvin. He said, "Can we talk to you?" So I walked out of the meeting, took 5 minutes, and he showed me an idea. And that idea had something. I just could feel it immediately. And even though it was a bit like Marley described, the little pin things, but I said, "Great, go for it." And so I go back to the meeting, and now I'm actually feeling a degree of hope. And so the meeting finished at 6 o'clock, and I decided, okay, I got to see what they've done. I walked down to the creative department. The first thing I noticed is silence. And I realized it's empty. There's no one there. So at this point, I'm absolutely livid. Here we are, the fate of the agency resting on the hands of these 3 guys, and they're not there. And I remember storming back to my office and going, I can't believe this. Just wait till I get hold of Alvin. Thinking murder on my mind, if I'm honest. And then I noticed stacked on my desk was this stack of artboards. You remember in those days we did stuff on boards all the time. And I'm looking at this stack of artboards, and I started to go through it. In 2 hours, those guys have created 3 television ads, 6 magazine ads, 6 billboard ads, and a whole pile of ancillary material. Now, Brian Musgrove, who's here, is undoubtedly, in all my career, the fastest art director I've ever worked with. I used to think of him. And this was also a wonderful example of what happens when you have a big idea. The big idea just expands itself. And so basically, the next day I said to Alvin, what happened? Like, where were you guys? And he looked at me and he said, well, you know Tim likes to go home at 5 o'clock. So I'm going to take a trip down memory lane just for a second, because I found these 3 pictures and I thought they were kind of fun. So of course that, and I wanted to show this one because that's our dear late Bernard Brown, who is one of the few people in our wonderful community. And of course the stunningly beautiful Paulette Dussault, who remains so today. And the other guy, you might not recognize him, but it's actually me. Now this one was, anyone remember this? So in this room we have Vanita Peake, who's holding the pastries. We have Alvin Wasserman. We have Lloyd Warnes. Lloyd, did you get picked, by the way? And of course myself. This was in honor of the United Way, that the management team decided to serve breakfast to the employees, and we committed to dressing up, and it was a very, very fun morning. And the last picture is actually when I got promoted, and it's funny how many people can recognize themselves in this picture. I can see a few. There's an awful lot who aren't here too. But this is the famous Tim Dundon. Tim Dundon, who was the architect of the great Chevron ads, and also of a Canadian campaign I'm going to show you in a minute. He really, I loved working with Tim. He had such a droll sense of humor. He never ever seemed to take it seriously, and yet he produced some of the greatest work one is ever going to see. So, what do we have next? Okay, so these ads, and let's just sort of go through these, because this was the result of this 2 hours that Alvin and Tim spent together, which is that everywhere in the world is now a Canadian city. It was such a brilliant concept. There was a moment, I still remember sitting in my office one day, because this agency, when it went to work, was a relentless force. It was amazing. And we produced all these ads in a very, very short period of time. And there was a moment when I was sitting in my office, almost every single one of the creative group were overseas. All of the account people on Canadian were overseas, except me and Bob Anderson, the junior guy. And Tim was in Hong Kong. Alvin tells me he was in Fiji with, believe it or not, Gloria Makarenko, who is, of course, now famed on the CBC News. And Jonathan Chilvers was in Amsterdam. Arlene was in Japan, and Tim was in Hong Kong. So what an amazing journey they all had while I sit and watch the rain in Vancouver. I thought there was something kind of unfair about that. The next crisis that occurred was Canadian boldly announced to us that they are moving to Calgary. Frank immediately said to me, so you're moving to Calgary? And I went, not. But again, we did a compromise where I moved to Calgary for half my life. And I had an apartment in Calgary and spent 3 days a week there. Amazingly, 3 of the account group volunteered to go and work in Calgary. 1 of the media department volunteered. And the one person who wasn't putting his hand up was my dear friend Alvin Wasserman, who said, I'm not moving nor living there. But he did agree at that point that he would staff up the creative department, and we built a full service agency in Calgary from an embryo agency of maybe 10 people up to an agency of around 35 people to service this client's needs. Today it seems insane, doesn't it? You know, because people use agencies all over the world, and yet we were expected to be in that marketplace. So we adjusted to the move, and it was probably one of the easier crises to manage because it was just inconvenient as opposed to about advertising. And then the next thing that happened, which did shock us, and was the takeover of Ward Air. Now, Ward Air, as some of you will remember, became a scheduled airline. From a charter airline to a scheduled airline, and for this wonderful period of time, we had 3 major airlines servicing this country. It was an astonishing time, mostly because they all offered triple bonus points, which is how I managed to collect my 360,000. But from an agency point of view, it's an incredibly challenging thing when a client starts going through yet another merger. Frank Anfield, who taught me a lot of what I know in this business, said to me very early on, he said, the greatest challenge that an agency faces is surviving the change in its client's management. And it's absolute truth. It's the most difficult thing to get over because each new person. So we knew change was coming. Our first piece was sort of managing to get through how to introduce this merger. And then the second piece came when they completely shuffled their whole advertising department. And we were now facing a new day where not a single person that we worked with was someone we worked with before. It was like a brand new client. The director of advertising was actually a really nice young man named Ken Lambert. Everyone's young to me these days. He just kind of seems young. I'm not even sure how old he is now. But anyway, he was a real straight shooter. And he was actually relatively easy to deal with, not because he was a good client. He wasn't a good client, because a good client does what John Pluel used to do. A good client does what Chevron used to do, which is trust their agency to come up with the ideas and then allow them to fulfill them. But what Ken Lambert said, I know what I want when I see it. It's sort of, any of you ever worked with a client like that? It's a really interesting sort of thing. Now, the master at dealing with clients like that is my dear friend Alvin Wasserman, because he really knows how to get into people's heads. And I remember this, actually I forgot to show a commercial, didn't I? What's the next commercial? Oh, the next one's good. I haven't forgotten it now. So we had a meeting in Vancouver. It was a Sunday. The whole creative team came in on a Sunday, which I forever owed them a debt. And we presented 8 concepts to Ken. And Ken basically disliked 6 of them, didn't mind 1 of them, and was kind of really curious about the 8th, which was developed by Tim Dundon. And it featured an American named Steve Landersberg, who was a star of the TV show called Barney Miller. Anyone remember Barney? Anyone young or? So, Hal Linden, right, you got it. So we put together some scripts, and his interest grew, and Tim wrote some of the most unbelievably witty scripts you're ever going to want to read. We actually brought Steve up and made 3 test commercials. And we then put them into research. They did incredibly well, and finally I remember presenting to the Senior Vice President of Marketing, Terry Francis, in Vancouver, and he finally blessed them, and we got to produce these great commercials. So why don't we just show those 3 commercials?
Amsterdam is a Canadian city.
Hong Kong, the Canadian city.
Roma is Canadian city.
Rio is a Canadian city.
Sydney, it's a Canadian city, mate.
Canadian. You can enjoy our Canadian hospitality across 5 continents.
So that goes back to the Canadian Cities campaign, which was...
How's your new diet coming?
Oh, I lost an eighth of a pound last week.
That's terrific. Do you have any dessert?
No, not for me.
Try that, please. Well, I figure the atmosphere is thinner up here. So,
Yeah.
this cheesecake, 30,000 feet, is 3 calories tops. Tops.
All right. I think I'll start with that cream puff right there.
Ooh, good choice. Looks light. Very light.
Yeah. And could you just leave the tray?
Good idea. Yeah, we're gonna get to London right on time. Isn't that great? The Canadians, great airline. Business class is comfortable, isn't it? Isn't this very comfortable? I love it. This is so pretty. This is Royal Dalton China. Have you ever been to London before? Grasping the bird's tail, right?
You know Tai Chi?
Oh yeah, I watch it on cable. People out in the park in Hong Kong, it's just a fascinating scene. Hand strums the lute.
Very good.
Yeah, I love Hong Kong. It's just the most gorgeous city. It's oh hello. Passenger sips the coffee.
Pardon?
I breathe Tai Chi.
It's only happened to me once before in my career where, for reasons totally unconnected with the actual value of the advertising, completely disconnected from the customer response, a client gets caught up in something that has nothing to do with advertising or marketing. And in this case, at one point, somebody wrote a letter to the Globe and Mail saying, what a Canadian doing using an American spokesperson. And somehow this rippled through the halls of Calgary to the point where the senior executive of PWA got unsettled by this response. And there came a ruling down, a dictate, that we had to pull this advertising and take it off the air. It was one of those insane decisions that comes when the wrong people are making decisions in this business. But it was real, it hit us, and it disturbed us a lot. We did replace it with another campaign which was focused on customers and product. It was a good campaign, but it really didn't have the legs that this campaign had. And the campaign actually won a gold medal in the New York Festival, I think it was, out in New York. So this was, we're now in May of 1989 or 1990, can't remember which. 1990. And we're working with, we're doing all the work that comes with, you would not believe how intense the work is on a global account that work operates in so many markets with so many products. It was really phenomenal. And so the agency was always busy. And then I remember calling the Vice President of Marketing to go and have lunch with him. And he said to me, oh, let's go jogging instead. So I said, oh, okay. And so that morning, this particular morning, a morning that will stay forever in my life, I grabbed my gear, took him to the office, and I was sitting at my desk. And the first thing that happened was I got a call from the president of iMasters, a nice guy named Tom Bollum, and he said, by the way, I've just sold the company, and we want to stop our advertising immediately. And I went, oh my God, that's like $300,000 in revenue gone. Within an hour, I got a call from the president of McGavin's, a gentleman named Marty Colonel, who said, I've decided to switch agencies. I'm moving everything to your sister agency, VRH. At this point, I go, oh, there's another 200,000 gone. This is not turning out to be a good day. I then went jogging with my client, and somewhere along the Bow River, he says to me, oh, by the way, we're going to do another agency review. And he sort of said it like that, you know, like I almost couldn't hear him. And I said, pardon? He said, well, we have to do another agency review. That was nothing. Like, I said, you just did one. Like, how can you do another one? Oh, well, things, you know, things have changed, you know, war, air, all this thing. And like, he was not a good communicator, to say the least. Anyway, by the end of the get-together, I thought I persuaded him to let us do a review of our work over the past 12 months. So he could at least, he hadn't been involved in anything for over 12 months. And I thought I persuaded him, but a few days later, after speaking to my boss, Jim Anderson, in Toronto, he said, well, let's get Peter out here. And so he and I flew out for a Blue Jays game. It was the only day I've ever done a day trip to Toronto. It was quite a remarkable thing. And we watched this game and at some point during the game, he turned to Jim Anderson and says, we have to do a Canadian review. Well, any of you who knows Jim, and I know Frank knows him really well, will know what Jim's response was. He was less than impressed, and let Peter know it in no uncertain terms that this was a break of trust. This was not good faith, and however, you know, Peter assured him that it would be a fair review and that we would all have a chance, and that we should put our hat in the ring, and so I flew back, sitting on the plane next to him that night. We actually had a strange experience. We got to the airport. The plane had already theoretically left. But because he was a Canadian employee, they hadn't actually pulled back from the gate, and the person at the gate went down the gangway, the galley, and she waved to the captain. And he opened up the doors, and we managed to catch this flight. I've never had that happen before or since. Anyway, it was a very uncomfortable ride back, to say the least. And frankly, my heart didn't feel in doing a third review. It just, and I knew Alvin felt the same. And then a very interesting thing happened. I got a phone call from Ken Lambert, and he said to me, "Can I come and see you? I need to come and see you." And so he came over to my office. He said, "I want to do it in your office, not mine." So I came over to his office, and he said, "Peter told you about the review." I said, "Yes." He said, "You need to know something." He said, "You cannot win it. We will change agencies, no matter what you're told or what you hear. This agency, this client is going to move agencies." And I said, "But why? But why? Is it about me?" He said, No. He said, "I'll get you a job with a new agency if you like." He said, "This is about something that I can't tell you about now." He said, "It's bigger than you, it's bigger than me, but all I can tell you is don't compete. It's not worth your time and money." So that made it really easy, right? I could call my boss and say, "Look, we can't do this. It doesn't make any sense under these circumstances." He flew off to see Reece Eaton and basically gave him shit for half an hour about behaving in this way, but to no avail. And so we decided to resign it. And this led to probably a comical ending, because I wrote my client a letter of resignation, and almost as soon as he got it, the phone rang. And he's almost apoplectic. This was not Ken Lambert, this was Ken Lambert's boss. And he's almost apoplectic. And he says, "You can't resign, we're firing you." And so ended my time on Canadian. I'd just like to leave you with a couple of reflections. But first of all, a sense of appreciation for the amazing work that was done for this client, really from 1942, but particularly during the 10 years I was with McKim, and even more particularly in the 3 years. I was counting back today and just realizing how much work, how many television campaigns we created in less than 3 years. It really was quite astonishing. And so there was this wonderful work. I've developed a belief in karma. Karma means that there's a response for your actions in this life or the next. And I really think Canadian got exactly what they deserved. This airline, they were not honourable people. They did not have any integrity, particularly once they got taken over by PWA. During the time that we witnessed them fire 25 vice presidents of CP Air, they removed everyone from the CP Air arena. And I realized sometime after the agency change occurred that really we were just a persona non grata, because we were still too associated with the old CP Air. PWA were too proud. They wanted nothing to do with anything connected with CP Air. To their chagrin and their detriment, Frank can probably tell this story better than I can, but CP Air had this remarkable president they'd hired named Donald Carty. Donald Carty went on to become president of American Airlines. He was a really outstanding performer. And PWA, when they took over, had the nerve to go to him and say, "Look, we don't want to keep you, but maybe you'd stay on for a year and teach our guy how to do it." You know, like, it was the height of insanity. And I'll tell you one story I heard about taking takeover of Ward Air. It's such a great story, because I heard it from a Ward Air employee. Ward Air had a brilliant product. It was outstanding. I remember flying from business class from Vancouver to Toronto on Ward Air just to test it out. And it was amazing. And I also noticed that around me were all the movers and shakers in Vancouver. Like, the people were leaving in droves to fly Ward Air because the product was so good. What nobody knew was it was totally unsustainable, that Max Ward was going bankrupt. And just before the takeover, he actually, the employees' payroll was not getting met. And then Max pulled off this incredible double bluff. He went to the chairman of PWA and said, "There isn't room, you and I both know there's not room for 3 airlines in this country. I want to buy you. I will offer you $700 million. I have this negotiated with the First Bank of Boston." And so he said, "But if you don't accept my offer, you have to buy me for $200 million. So Canadian juggled the numbers, and they came back to him and said, "It's not enough, but we will buy you for $200 million. Max Ward took home $60 million to put in his bank account. Canadian took home an airline which didn't own a single plane and owed the bank $1 billion. They never ever recovered from that decision. It was the decision that actually eventually crippled them. So the other thing I just want to finish with, I'm so glad to say that so many of the people at McKim who worked so hard for this airline and got no real recognition at the end, they all came through it in this wonderful way. And it's by seeing so many tonight, how many people thrived after Canadian left. And I count myself as one of them. So thank you very much for listening to us.